Before we begin, if you find yourself enchanted by tales of the peculiar and the melancholic, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that lurk in the shadows of history and imagination. Tonight's offering is the first chapter of B2's story of the nobleman who married a ghost, and regretted it slightly, titled Guy Lonely Nobleman of Blackwood Halling. Chapter 1. The Lonely Nobleman of Blackwood Hall. Lord Eldric Blackwood had long since accepted that his life was a monument to solitude. Blackwood Hall, his ancestral estate, stood as a crumbling testament to a family lineage that had, much like the mortar between its stones, slowly eroded into obscurity. The hall was a grand thing once, all sweeping staircases and vaulted ceilings, but now it sagged under the weight of neglect, its corridors echoing with the whispers of drafts and the occasional disgruntled rodent. Eldric, the last of his name, moved through these halls like a spectre himself, his footsteps muffled by layers of dust and resignation. He was not an unhandsome man, though the years of isolation had carved hollows beneath his cheeks and a permanent crease between his brows. His hair, once a rich chestnut, had faded to the color of old parchment. And his eyes, well, his eyes were the sort that made visitors uneasy. They were the pale gray of a winter sky, and they held a peculiar intensity, as if he were perpetually on the verge of recognizing something just beyond the edge of sight. It was this quality, perhaps, that kept the villagers from lingering too long in his presence. That, and the rumors. There were always rumors about Blackwood Hall. Some said the place was cursed, that the Blackwoods had made a pact with something unspeakable in exchange for their wealth, and that the debt had come due generations later in the form of withering crops, stillborn heirs, and a creeping malaise that clung to the land. Others insisted the hall was haunted, though by what or whom no one could quite agree. Eldric paid these whispers little mind. After all, if the hall was haunted, the ghosts had the decency to leave him be, which was more than he could say for the living. His days followed a predictable rhythm. He rose late, took a meager breakfast of cold porridge and bitter tea, and then wandered the estate with the air of a man conducting an inspection of his own ruin. Some afternoons he attempted correspondence with distant relatives or creditors, though these efforts usually ended with him tossing the parchment into the fire unread. Evenings were spent in the library, where he sipped watered-down brandy and pretended to read by the light of a guttering candle. The books, like everything else in Blackwood Hall, were slowly surrendering to time, their spines cracking, their pages foxed with damp. It was on one such evening, as Eldric sat staring blankly at a volume of poetry he had no intention of finishing, that he first heard the sound. At first he thought it was the wind. The hall was forever groaning and sighing like an old man in his sleep. But then it came again. A laugh. Soft, lilting, undeniably feminine. It was not the sort of sound one expected to hear in a decaying manor on the edge of nowhere, least of all from a room that had been empty for decades. Eldric frowned, setting the book aside. He was not a man prone to fancy, but neither was he fool enough to dismiss the possibility that he had finally succumbed to the isolation. Still, curiosity, or perhaps the brandy, compelled him to rise and follow the sound down the darkened corridor to the old music room. The door was ajar, which was odd, because Eldric could not recall the last time he had set foot inside. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a whine. The room was, as he remembered it, a grand piano shrouded in a yellowed sheet, a harp missing half its strings, and a thick layer of dust over everything. The moonlight streaming through the cracked windows painted the scene in shades of silver and shadow. And then he saw her. A woman stood by the piano, her back to him, her fingers trailing lightly over the covered keys. She was dressed in a gown that might have been fashionable a century ago, its fabric shimmering faintly as if woven from moonlight itself. Her hair was piled in an elaborate coiffure, though a few loose curls cascaded down her neck. Eldric's breath caught. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. And then she turned to face him, and he realized with a jolt that he could see the harp right through her. She smiled, as if his shock were the most delightful thing in the world. "Good evening, my lord," she said, her voice like the chime of a distant bell. "I was beginning to think you'd never visit." Eldric, for the first time in years, found himself at a loss for words. The ghost, for she could be nothing else, tilted her head, her expression amused. Got your tongue? Or are you simply unused to company?" Eldric began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "Who are you?" Her smile widened. "Oh, I'm no one important. Just the lady of the house." "The lady of the house," he repeated, his voice flat. "Well," she amended, "one of them. There have been so many over the years, but I do think I was the most charming." Eldric pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'm hallucinating." The ghost sighed. "Men always say that, as if the alternative, that a woman might simply be where she pleases, is too dreadful to consider." She drifted closer, her skirts making no sound as they brushed the floor. "Tell me, my lord, do you often hallucinate beautiful women in your music room?" Eldric opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Precisely," she said, satisfied. "No. Shall we begin again? My name is Lady Seraphina Lestrange, and I have been waiting for you for a very long time." Eldric Blackwood, who had spent the better part of his life wishing for something, anything, to disrupt the monotony of his existence, suddenly found himself wondering if he ought to have been more specific in his desires. Chapter 2. The Whispering Portrait. Lord Eldric Blackwood was not by nature a man who believed in ghosts. Or at least, he hadn't been until Lady Seraphina Lestrange had glided into his life, or rather, his death, with all the subtlety of a harpsichord falling down a flight of stairs. 3 nights had passed since their initial encounter, and in that time Eldric had oscillated between fascination, skepticism, and the creeping suspicion that he had finally lost his mind. He had attempted to dismiss her as a figment of loneliness, a trick of the light, or perhaps the result of consuming brandy that had been aging in the cellar since before his grandfather's time. But Seraphina was persistent. She had a habit of appearing just as he had convinced himself she wasn't real, materializing in doorways, humming forgotten melodies in empty rooms, or once, rather disconcertingly, sitting at the foot of his bed while he slept. On the 4th evening, Eldric decided to investigate. If there was any truth to the notion that Blackwood Hall was haunted, there ought to be some record of it. The family archives were a mess of yellowed ledgers, crumbling letters, and the occasional desiccated spider. But if there had ever been a Lady Seraphina Lestrange connected to the Blackwoods, he would find her. It was during this search, deep in the shadowed recesses of the estate's least visited wing, that he stumbled upon the portrait. The painting was half hidden behind a moth-eaten tapestry, its frame thick with dust. Eldric pulled the cloth aside with a grunt, sending a small avalanche of debris tumbling to the floor. The figure in the portrait was unmistakably Seraphina. She wore the same gown, the same sly smile, and her eyes, those unsettlingly vivid eyes, seemed to follow him as he shifted his weight from foot to foot. Eldric frowned. "Well, that's unnerving." A soft laugh echoed through the room, though there was no one there to produce it. "You should see your face." Seraphina's voice murmured, as if carried on the draught curling through the cracked window. Eldric scowled at the portrait. "Are you in there?" The painted Seraphina did not move, but the voice came again, amused. "In a manner of speaking, though I've always found portraits dreadfully limiting, one can only smirk mysteriously for so long before it becomes tedious." Eldric exhaled sharply through his nose. "If you're not in the painting, how are you?" "Oh, don't trouble yourself with the mechanics of it, my lord," she interrupted. "Ghosts rarely follow rules, and I've never been one for tedious explanations." He rubbed his temples. "Right, of course. Why would the undead feel compelled to make sense? Precisely, she agreed, as if he had finally grasped some fundamental truth. No. Since you've gone to the trouble of uncovering my likeness, tell me, do you find it flattering? The artist was rather fond of me, though I think he exaggerated the curve of my lips. Eldric studied the portrait with reluctant scrutiny. The brushwork was masterful, capturing not just her features, but something of her presence. The way light seemed to cling to her, as if reluctant to let her fade into shadow. It's accurate, he admitted grudgingly. High praise indeed, she said dryly. Though I suppose I should be grateful you didn't call it tolerable. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant creak of settling floorboards. Eldric found himself staring at the portrait longer than necessary, as though expecting it to blink. "Why are you here?" he asked at last. The air grew cooler, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, "I was bound to this place long before you were born, Lord Blackwood. A matter of unfinished business." "What business?" Her laughter this time was quieter, almost melancholy. "If I knew that, do you think I'd still be drifting through these drafty corridors?" Eldric opened his mouth to press further, but a sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and when he looked back, the portrait's eyes were no longer following him. They were fixed straight ahead, as static and inanimate as any ordinary painting. He was alone again. That night, Eldric dreamed of Seraphina, not as she was in the portrait, but as she had been in the music room, her fingers trailing over the piano keys. In the dream she turned to him with a smile and said, "You'll find the answers you're looking for in the attic." He woke with a start, the words lingering like an echo. The attic. Of course. If there was anywhere in Blackwood Hall that had been left undisturbed for centuries, it was the attic. Eldric dressed hastily, ignoring the way the hall seemed to whisper as he passed. The staircase to the attic was tucked behind a narrow door in the servants' quarters, its wooden steps groaning under his weight. The air grew thicker with every step, heavy with the scent of old paper, damp wool, and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried ink. The attic was a labyrinth of forgotten things. Trunks of outdated fashions, broken furniture, and stacks of ledgers so old their ink had faded to ghosts of themselves. And there, propped against a cobwebbed vanity, was another portrait. This one was smaller, its frame less ornate, but the subject was undeniably Seraphina. She was younger here, her expression less assured, almost hesitant. At the bottom of the frame, a tarnished plaque read, "Lady Seraphina Lestrange, betrothed to Lord Eldric Blackwood, 1782. Eldric stared at it, his pulse quickening. Alistair Blackwood had been his great-great-uncle, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in family records. He had died young, under mysterious circumstances, and his betrothal had been struck from official histories. Until now. The portrait's eyes met his, and this time they didn't just follow him, they narrowed. "Took you long enough," Seraphina's voice whispered from the canvas. Eldric swallowed. "You were engaged to my ancestor." "Oh, engaged is such a polite word for it," she said, her tone sharpening. "Tell me, Lord Blackwood, do you know how Alistair died?" He didn't. The records had been suspiciously vague. Seraphina's painted lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. "I do." And then, with a sound like tearing parchment, the portrait went still. Eldric was left standing in the attic, the weight of centuries pressing down on him, and the unmistakable sense that he had just stepped into a story far older and far darker than he had ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Midnight Pact. Lord Eldric Blackwood was not a man prone to impulse. His life had been a series of deliberate, if melancholy, decisions, each one leading him deeper into the quiet ruin of Blackwood Hall. But the discovery of Seraphina's betrothal portrait had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The idea that his ancestor had been entangled with her only for both to vanish into obscurity, one into death, the other into ghosthood, nagged at him like a loose tooth. He spent the next few days in a haze of brandy and restless investigation, poring over family records for any mention of Alistair's fate. The archives yielded nothing but frustrating gaps, pages torn out, entries smudged beyond recognition, and one particularly infuriating ledger that simply read, "Let it be forgotten," in shaky script. Eldric wasn't sure if that referred to Alistair, Seraphina, or some other scandal altogether, but the deliberate erasure only sharpened his curiosity. By the third evening, he had consumed enough brandy to make the portraits sway when he passed them, and enough frustration to make him reckless. He found himself standing before the larger portrait of Seraphina in the abandoned wing, its frame gleaming faintly in the candlelight. "You're being deliberately cryptic," he accused, gesturing with his half-empty glass. "If you wanted me to know something, why not just say it?" The painted Seraphina remained still, her enigmatic smile unchanged. But the air in the room grew heavy, thickening with the scent of old roses and something metallic, like the tang of blood long dried. Eldric scowled and took another swig. Typical. Haunt a man's house, lead him to your portrait, imply some dreadful secret, and then refuse to elaborate. Is this how all ghosts behave? Or are you just especially vexing? A breeze fluttered through the room, though the windows were shut. The candle flames bent sideways, casting elongated shadows that slithered up the walls. Then, softly, as if carried on the breath of the draught itself, came her voice. "Some truths cannot be spoken aloud, my lord. They must be witnessed." Eldric snorted. More riddles. Wonderful. He was about to turn away when the portrait's eyes flickered, not metaphorically but literally, the painted irises rolling to fix on him with unsettling focus. Eldric froze, his grip tightening on the glass. "You want answers," Seraphina murmured, her voice no longer confined to the air, but seeming to rise from the canvas itself. "Then make a vow." "A vow?" Eldric echoed, too startled to scoff. The candlelight dimmed, pooling around the portrait like a spotlight. "A binding one. A promise that cannot be undone." Eldric's head was swimming, whether from the brandy or the strangeness of the moment, he couldn't say. "What kind of promise?" Seraphina's painted lips parted. "Marry me." The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Eldric barked a laugh. "You're dead. And you're drunk," she countered smoothly. "It eves out." He opened his mouth, closed it, then took another fortifying sip of brandy. "You can't be serious." The portrait's expression shifted, just slightly, into something almost wistful. "I was engaged to a Blackwood once. It ended poorly. But vows have power, even beyond death. Swear yourself to me, and I will show you what became of Alistair. What really became of him." Eldric knew he should walk away. This was the sort of decision made by fools in cheap Gothic novels, the kind who inevitably found themselves cursed, haunted, or worse. But the brandy had dulled his better judgment, and the loneliness of Blackwood Hall had worn him thin. Besides, what was the harm? It wasn't as if a drunken vow to a ghost could actually bind him. "Fine," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "I, Lord Eldric Blackwood, do hereby pledge to marry the ghost in the painting." Happy? The moment the words left his lips, the candle flames snuffed out. The room plunged into darkness so complete it felt like being swallowed. Eldric staggered back, his heart hammering, as a chill raced up his spine. Then, from somewhere impossibly close, came the whisper of fabric and the faintest press of lips against his ear. "Cavalier," Seraphina breathed. The candles flared back to life. Eldric stood alone in the room, his brandy glass now empty. The portrait was just a portrait again, its subject serene and motionless. But something had changed. The air felt charged, as if after a lightning strike, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, thicker, watching. Eldric rubbed his face, suddenly sober despite the alcohol. "Well," he muttered to himself, "that was monumentally stupid." He half expected Seraphina to reply, but the silence held. Shaking his head, he turned to leave, only to freeze mid-step. The hallway outside was no longer the dim, familiar stretch of Blackwood Hall. Instead, it stretched into an impossible corridor, its walls lined with doors that hadn't been there moments before. Eldric's breath caught. The air smelled of damp earth and old blood. From the depths of the hallway, a door creaked open. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of someone or something weeping. Chapter 4. The Ghostly Bride's Demands. Lord Eldric Blackwood had expected many things from his impromptu spectral engagement. Uneasy dreams, perhaps, or the occasional disembodied whisper in the dark. What he had not anticipated was paperwork. It arrived the morning after his ill-advised vow, materializing on his writing desk with an ominous crispness. The parchment was yellowed at the edges, but unnervingly pristine where it mattered, the ink a deep black that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. At the top, in elegant looping script, it read, "A conditions of matrimonial agreement between the late Lady Seraphina Lestrange and Lord Eldric Blackwood, herein referred to as the Haunted and the Haunter." Eldric stared at it for a long moment before picking it up with 2 fingers, as though it might dissolve into spiders at any moment. "Seraphina?" he called, half expecting her to materialize in a swirl of ectoplasm and dry commentary. No answer came, but the fireplace across the room abruptly roared to life, despite the absence of kindling or flame. Eldric sighed and began to read. The first few clauses were almost charming in their absurdity. Article Press. The haunter shall henceforth refer to the haunted as my dearest, beloved spectre, or, in moments of particular vexation, that infernal woman. Under no circumstances is ghostly nuisance or painting-based pest to be employed, no matter how apt the description may seem. Sin prevents non cados, besi in the papito, caplet twin. Article the Seton. The West Wing bedroom, presently infested with moths and what appears to be a family of particularly melancholic bats, shall be refurbished to the haunted specifications, which include, but are not limited to, velvet drapes of an unspecified shade of midnight, but with more feeling, a harpsichord tuned to the key of lost souls, and a mirror that does not. I am known, concentrated, selling fisinus osar. Eldric pinched the bridge of his nose. This is ridiculous. The fireplace crackled pointedly. He read on. Article 3. On the 3rd night of every month, the haunter shall host a dinner in the haunted's honor. Act and dance is mandatory for all resident spirits, reluctant ancestors, and at least one living witness, to be selected based on their ability to feign enjoyment of spectral small talk. The menu shall consist of dishes that no longer exist, served on plates that cannot be broken, and accompanied by wine that may or may not be imaginary. Note: the haunter is still expected to pretend to taste it. Eldric was beginning to regret every life choice that had led him to this moment. Then he reached Article 4. Article 4. In accordance with the binding nature of this agreement, the haunter shall, within a fortnight, retrieve the remains of the haunted from their current resting place beneath the old wick elm in the north garden, and inter them in the Blackwood family crypt. Failure to comply will result in the haunted manifesting in increasingly dramatic fashion, up to and including full-bodied apparitions during the haunter's baths. How? Eldric set the parchment down very carefully. You're buried in my garden. The air beside him shimmered, and Seraphina coalesced into view, her gown fluttering as if caught in a breeze only she could feel. Technically, parts of me are buried in your garden. The rest are scattered across 3 counties, but I'd settle for the majority. Eldric's stomach lurched. What happened to you? Seraphina's expression darkened, her usual mirth fading into something colder. Your dear great-great-uncle happened. Alistair had a temper, you see, and a fondness for knives. Eldric suddenly wished he hadn't finished the brandy. Seraphina drifted closer, her form more solid than he'd ever seen it. The vow wasn't just about answers, my lord. It was about justice. And now that you've sworn yourself to me, you'll help me get it. Eldric opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat as Seraphina's hand, suddenly impossibly corporeal, closed around his wrist. Her touch was icy, but it didn't pass through him as it should have. It held egg. Starting, she said sweetly, with the wick elm. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves of Blackwood Hall like a thing in pain. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a clock struck 13. Eldric Blackwood, for the first time in his life, was very much awake. Chapter 5. A wedding in the witching hour. Lord Eldric Blackwood had endured many indignities in his life. Financial ruin, social ostracism, a particularly aggressive bout of gout in his 28th year. But standing in the crumbling great hall of Blackwood Hall at midnight, dressed in his grandfather's moth-eaten wedding coat and waiting to marry a ghost, was certainly the most surreal. The hall looked different at night. Moonlight streamed through the broken stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of color across the floor like spilled jewels. The air smelled of damp stone and something faintly floral, though no flowers had graced Blackwood Hall in decades. The only illumination came from a circle of black candles that had appeared in the center of the room, their flames burning an unnatural shade of blue. Eldric tugged at his cravat, which had tightened inexplicably around his throat. "This is absurd," he muttered to no one in particular. "Most weddings are," Seraphina said, materializing beside him in a swirl of silvery mist. She had forgone her usual gown for something more bridal. A high-necked dress of pale gray silk that shimmered like fog over a grave. A veil of cobweb-thin lace obscured her face, though it did nothing to hide her smirk. "Though I'll admit, ours has a certain originality." Eldric eyed her. "Are you actually wearing that, or are you just making me see it?" Seraphina lifted the veil and winked at him. "Does it matter?" Before Eldric could answer, the grand doors at the far end of the hall creaked open, and a diminutive figure shuffled in, clutching a book to his chest like a shield. Father Mortimer, the elderly vicar from the village, looked as though he would rather be anywhere else, which, given the circumstances, was entirely understandable. The priest's watery eyes darted from Eldric to the semi-corporeal bride, and back again. "Lord Blackwood," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I must once again protest this arrangement." Eldric sighed. "And yet, here you are." Father Mortimer swallowed hard. "You threatened to tell the bishop about my collection of, unconventional theological texts." "That was Seraphina's idea," Eldric said. The ghost in question smiled beatifically. "And a very good one, too. Now shall we begin? Midnight won't last forever." Father Mortimer looked as though he might faint, but he opened his book with shaky hands and cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here tonight in the, presence of—" His voice faltered as a particularly bold draught extinguished 3 of the candles. Seraphina sighed. "Skip to the vows, Father. I don't think anyone here cares about the sanctity of marriage at this point." The priest whimpered but complied. "Lord Blackwood, do you take this, Spiritin, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in undeath, forsaking all others until— well, until one of you ceases to exist in your current form?" Eldric opened his mouth, then paused. "That's not the traditional wording." Seraphina elbowed him, an impressive feat given her general lack of corporeality. "Do you wanting to spend eternity arguing with a dead woman? Because I can make that happen." Eldric considered this. "I suppose not." "Then say, I do, Eldric muttered. Father Mortimer turned to Seraphina. And do you, apparition, take Lord Blackwood to be your husband, binding yourself to him in this life and whatever comes after? Seraphina's smile turned sharp. Oh, absolutely. The priest swallowed again, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork in rough seas. Then, by the power vested in me by the Church and apparently forces beyond my comprehension, I now pronounce you man and spirit. You may, He trailed off, eyeing Seraphina's translucent form with trepidation. Kiss the bride? Seraphina suggested, batting her eyelashes. Eldric hesitated. Will I lose feeling in my lips? Only temporarily. With a resigned sigh, Eldric leaned in. To his surprise, Seraphina's lips were not the icy void he'd expected, but something closer to a winter breeze, cool, but not unpleasant. For a fleeting moment, he could almost convince himself she was real. Then she pulled back, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Congratulations, husband. You're now legally bound to a vengeful spirit. I do hope you have a good solicitor. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the remaining candles, plunging the hall into darkness. When the light returned, courtesy of the moon sliding out from behind a cloud, Father Mortimer was gone, the great doors swinging shut behind him with a final sounding thud. Eldric blinked. Did he just flee his own ceremony? Seraphina shrugged. To be fair, he held out longer than I expected. She floated toward the windows, her form growing more substantial with every passing moment. Now, about our honeymoon. Eldric groaned. Please tell me we're not going to the Wick Elm tonight. Seraphina's laughter echoed through the hall, mingling with the sigh of the wind through the rafters. Oh, my dear husband, she said, her voice rich with amusement, the night is young, and the dead are very patient. Outside, a clock tower in the village struck one, though no such clock existed within 20 miles of Blackwood Hall. Eldric Blackwood, newlywed and newly haunted, had the distinct impression his life was about to become significantly more complicated. Chapter 6. The first night and its many problems. Lord Eldric Blackwood had always considered himself a practical man, the sort who could adapt to most inconveniences with stoic resignation. A leaking roof. Annoying, but manageable. A wine cellar infested with spectral mold. Unpleasant, but not catastrophic. Sharing his marital bed with a restless spirit who had very particular opinions about pillow arrangement. That, he was discovering, might be the breaking point of his sanity. The bedchamber, which had once been a place of quiet solitude, now resembled the aftermath of a particularly violent poltergeist attack. The heavy velvet curtains billowed without wind, the candles flickered between colors that did not exist in nature, and the blankets had developed a distressing habit of vanishing entirely whenever Eldric reached for them. He sat rigidly on the edge of the four-poster bed, still fully dressed in his wedding coat, staring at the space beside him, where his new bride reclined with an air of smug satisfaction. You're not actually lying on the bed, are you? Eldric asked, eyeing the way Seraphina's form sank slightly into the mattress despite her being technically incorporeal. She stretched her arms above her head, her fingers passing through the headboard without resistance. Of course not. But it's the thought that counts. Then why do the sheets keep moving? Atmosphere, darling. She rolled onto her side, propping her head up with one translucent hand. A proper haunting requires attention to detail. And besides, you look adorably bewildered when your blankets slither off you at 3 in the morning. Eldric rubbed his temples. This is going to be a very long marriage. Seraphina laughed, the sound like wind chimes made of bone. Oh, you have no idea. With a sigh, Eldric finally gave up and lay down, keeping a careful distance from the spectral presence beside him. The moment his head touched the pillow, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath fogged in the air, and he could feel the cold radiating from Seraphina, like an open grave in midwinter. He gritted his teeth and pulled what remained of the blankets tighter around himself. "Must you do that?" "Do what?" Seraphina asked, innocently. "Turn the bedchamber into an icy house." She sighed dramatically, and the cold intensified. "It's not intentional, I assure you. Ghosts don't exactly have control over their ambient temperature. It's a side effect of being dead." She paused, then added thoughtfully, "Though I suppose I could try to focus on warmer memories, summer afternoons, sunlit gardens, that sort of thing." The chill lessened slightly, replaced by a faint, musty warmth, like sunlight filtered through old stained glass. Eldric closed his eyes, willing himself to ignore the absurdity of his situation. He had just begun to drift off when a sharp tug on the blankets yanked him back to wakefulness. The covers were now neatly arranged on Seraphina's side of the bed, despite the fact that she had no physical form with which to claim them. Eldric sat up. "How are you doing that?" Seraphina blinked at him, all wide-eyed innocence. "Doing what?" "The blankets, they're moving," she gasped, pressing a spectral hand to her chest. "Are you accusing me of spectral interference, husband? I'm wounded. Perhaps it's just a draft." "A draft?" Eldric repeated flatly. "Blackwood Hall is very old. Who knows what strange little breezes find their way through the walls?" She waved a hand, and the blankets twitched again, sliding another inch toward her. "See? Just the wind." Eldric considered arguing, then decided it was not worth the energy. He lay back down, resigned to a sleepless night. The moment he closed his eyes, however, a new problem presented itself: sound. Or rather, the complete lack thereof. The usual nighttime noises of the estate, the creak of floorboards, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of mice in the walls, had all vanished, leaving behind a silence so absolute it pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. Worse still was the absence of Seraphina's breathing. He hadn't realized how accustomed he'd grown to the sound of another person in the room until it was gone, replaced by nothing at all. He opened his eyes to find her watching him, her expression unreadable. "You're staring," he muttered. "You're brooding," she countered. "It's our wedding night, and you're lying there like a man awaiting execution." Eldric turned his head to look at her properly. "I married a ghost. I think a certain amount of brooding is warranted." Seraphina's lips quirked into a smile. "Fair enough." She shifted closer, her form flickering like candlelight. "But you might as well make the best of it. After all, how many men can say they've shared a bed with a woman who doesn't snore?" "I wouldn't know. You don't breathe." "Precisely. No snoring, no hogging the blankets. The blankets are currently on your side of the bed, and no risk of me complaining about your cold feet." She smirked. "Though I suppose that's my department now." Eldric groaned and pulled a pillow over his face. "Remind me why I agreed to this." "Because you were drunk, lonely, and secretly fascinated by me." She plucked the pillow from his grasp and tossed it aside. "Admit it, you like having me around." Eldric didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Seraphina took that as victory and settled back against the headboard, her form fading slightly as the candlelight dimmed. The room settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric, as the blankets continued their slow migration toward the spectral occupant of the bed. Just as Eldric was finally beginning to drift off, a new sensation made his eyes snap open. The unmistakable feeling of icy fingers trailing up his arm. He turned his head to find Seraphina watching him with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Still awake?" she murmured. Eldric sighed. "I am now." "Good." Her fingers danced higher, leaving a trail of goosebumps in their wake. "Because I just remembered something rather important." Eldric swallowed. "And what's that?" She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered, "I never got a wedding present." The candles blew out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. Eldric had just enough time to wonder what fresh torment he'd invited into his life before the blankets yanked themselves entirely off the bed, and the real haunting began. Chapter 7. The Haunted Household Adjustments. The staff of Blackwood Hall had weathered many peculiarities over the years. Leaking ceilings, unexplained drafts, the occasional bout of possessed silverware, but nothing could have prepared them for the arrival of their new mistress. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper who had ruled the estate's domestic affairs with an iron fist for 37 years, stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, surveying the latest disruption. A dozen eggs floated in midair, each rotating slowly like tiny celestial bodies, while a whisk stirred an empty bowl with enthusiastic abandon. "This," she announced to the gathered staff, "is unacceptable." The footman, a gangly youth named Timothy, gulped audibly. "It's witchcraft, is what it is." Cook, a woman built like a barrel and just as immovable, smacked him upside the head with a wooden spoon. "Don't be daft. Witchcraft requires intent. This is just ghostly housekeeping." From the doorway came a lilting laugh, and old heads turned as Lady Blackwood, or rather, the shimmering outline of Lady Blackwood, materialized near the pantry. "Oh, I do like that term," Seraphina said, drifting closer, "though I prefer to think of it as atmospheric redecorating." She waved a hand, and the eggs arranged themselves into a perfect pyramid on the counter. Mrs. Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "My lady, while we are honored by your presence, might I suggest the kitchen is no place for spectral interference? The soufflé collapsed twice yesterday." Seraphina's form flickered in what might have been a shrug. "Soufflé are temperamental creatures, much like husbands." She plucked an apple from the fruit bowl, and it promptly turned to ash in her grasp. "Oh dear, still working on that." The scullery maid fainted. Upstairs, Eldric was dealing with his own set of supernatural adjustments. He sat at his desk in the study, attempting to review the estate accounts while his inkwell emptied itself onto the ceiling, perfect looping script. The words "Remember our anniversary" glistened overhead in eerie black calligraphy before dripping slowly downward in defiance of gravity. Eldric pinched the bridge of his nose. "We've been married 3 days. We don't have an anniversary yet." The ink reversed course and spelled out exactly before splashing back into the well with a satisfied plop. Down the hall, the library had become a particular point of contention. Mr. Finch, the elderly librarian, had spent 60 years curating Blackwood Hall's collection with monastic devotion. He was not prepared for a mistress who rearranged shelves by flinging books through the air like startled pigeons. "Plato does not belong next to Mrs. Radcliffe's novels," he wailed as a first edition of the Republic soared past his ear. Seraphina appeared upside down from the chandelier, her skirts defying all laws of physics. "But they make such delightful conversation partners," she said. "Just imagine Symposium as a Gothic romance." Mr. Finch made a noise like a tea kettle, reaching its boiling point. The stables fared no better. The head groom, a grizzled man called Higgins, stormed into the house one afternoon with his hat in his hands, and his face the color of pickled beetroot. "My lord," he bellowed, "the horses won't stop waltzing." Eldric closed his eyes briefly before responding. "I'm sorry, they're what?" "Waltzing. In formation. At midnight." Higgins looked haunted. "The bay mare keeps leading." That evening, Eldric found Seraphina lounging in the parlor, idly conducting an invisible orchestra with one translucent hand. The curtains swayed in time, with music only she could hear. "Darling," he said, "are you teaching the livestock ballroom dancing?" She didn't pause her conducting. They were dreadfully stiff, all that galloping in straight lines, no artistry. "The groom is threatening to quit." "Nonsense. Higgins secretly loves it. He used to be quite the dancer in his youth." She flipped her hand, and the candelabra executed a perfect pirouette. Everyone needs more whimsy in their lives. Even the gardens weren't safe. The head gardener, a dour Scotsman named Macready, stormed into breakfast one morning clutching a fistful of roses that wept actual tears. "I will nae stand for this horticultural heresy," he growled, shaking the sobbing flowers at Eldric. Seraphina appeared from within the teapot. "Oh, don't be such a prune. They're happy tears." The roses burst into a chorus of greensleeves. By week's end, the entire household operated in a state of bemused exhaustion. Footmen carried spare handkerchiefs to dry weeping china. Cook baked extra cakes to appease the temperamental oven, which had developed a preference for minor key sonatas. Even Mrs. Holloway had begun leaving out little offerings of lavender sachets and bone buttons, though she would never admit it. Eldric found her one evening in the servants' hall, staring at a mop that was dancing a rather accomplished gavotte. "We can't go on like this," he said, though without much conviction. Mrs. Holloway sipped her tea. The sugar bowl floated up to add another lump without being asked. "Respectfully, my lord, I think we can." She watched as a cluster of dust bunnies formed a surprisingly graceful chorus line. "It's certainly never dull." Upstairs a door slammed. Then another. Then all of them in rapid succession, followed by the distinct sound of Seraphina laughing. Eldric sighed and reached for the brandy, only to find the decanter had grown little arms and was hugging his wrist affectionately. Blackwood Hall, for the first time in centuries, was alive, or at least undead and thoroughly enjoying itself. Chapter 8. The ball no one attended. Lord Eldric Blackwood had spared no expense for what society would later call that unfortunate spectral soirée. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Hall, usually draped in dust sheets and melancholy, had been polished to an eerie sheen. Crystal chandeliers glittered with hundreds of candles that burned without melting. Silver platters floated at perfect serving height, and the string quartet, hired at double their usual rate after much pleading, sat nervously tuning instruments that occasionally tuned themselves. Eldric adjusted his cravat for the 12th time, watching as the staff arranged refreshments that included both normal canopies and several dishes that existed only in theory. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered to no one in particular. A cold hand slipped into his. "Nonsense," Seraphina said, materializing beside him in a gown of shimmering ectoplasm and historical inaccuracy. "It's a wonderful idea. Your ancestors hosted scores of balls. Why shouldn't we?" "Because you're dead," Eldric pointed out. She waved a translucent hand. "A minor detail. Besides, everyone's been dying to meet me." The pun, Eldric noted with growing dread, was almost certainly intentional. The first carriage arrived precisely at 8, depositing the Wilmots, a family of middling nobility with more curiosity than sense, onto the steps. They were followed by the Featheringtons, the de Courcys, and eventually 24 other brave or foolhardy souls who had accepted the invitation out of morbid fascination. The guests milled about the entrance hall, their nervous chatter filling the air like the buzzing of disturbed wasps. Mrs. Holloway, magnificent in her starched black dress, announced each guest with flawless diction, though her eyes betrayed a deep skepticism about the evening's prospect. "Lord and Lady Wilmot," she intoned as the first couple approached. Lady Wilmot, a woman built like a wedding cake, peered around the hall. "How atmospheric," she whispered to her husband, clutching his arm with enough force to cut off circulation. Eldric stepped forward to greet them. "Welcome to Blackwood Hall. May I present my wife, the Lady Blackwood?" Seraphina chose that moment to materialize directly behind the Wilmots, her form flickering like candlelight. "Charmed," she said. Lady Wilmot screamed. This set the tone for the evening. By 9 o'clock, several guests had already retreated to the card room, where they huddled together for protection. The more intrepid attendees ventured onto the dance floor, though their courage wavered when the chandeliers began swaying to a rhythm no one else could hear. Young Miss Featherington, a brave soul with an unfortunate fondness for Gothic novels, was the first to attempt conversation with Seraphina. "My lady," she breathed, eyes wide. "What's it like being, you know?" Seraphina considered this while floating several inches above the floor. "Cold," she said finally, "and rather draughty. But the immortality has its perks." Miss Featherington swooned artfully into a footman's arms. The dancing progressed in fits and starts. The orchestra played a perfectly respectable quadrille, though the music occasionally shifted key without warning. Several guests reported feeling unseen hands guiding them through the steps, while Lord Wilmot insisted his cravat had tied itself into a noose before unraveling again. At 10:30, the real trouble began. The banquet tables, laden with both earthly and spectral delicacies, became the evening's focal point. Lady de Courcy nearly fainted when her fork floated away mid-bite, while the bishop spat out his wine after it transformed into something that tasted distinctly like sorrow. "It's just a simple transubstantiation," Seraphina explained cheerfully. "The spiritual counterpart to cooking." The bishop made the sign of the cross. His prayer book burst into blue flames. By 11, the first carriages were being called, though called was perhaps too polite a term. The Featheringtons departed at a run, their daughter still babbling about the romance of eternity. The Wilmots left shortly after, though not before Lady Wilmot's wig floated off her head and settled onto a suit of armor. At midnight, only the most determined, or inebriated, guests remained. Sir Reginald Thorne, an elderly knight with more brandy than sense in his system, raised a toast. "To Lord and Lady Blackwood," he slurred. "May your marriage be—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of the room's attention. "Actually, I can't think of an appropriate blessing for this situation." Seraphina raised her own glass, which contained liquid that changed color depending on who looked at it, and finished for him. "May it be interesting." The remaining windows blew open in unison. By 1 in the morning, Blackwood Hall stood empty of living guests, though the ballroom remained full of music only the dead could hear. Seraphina waltzed alone through the drifting candle smoke, her form shimmering like mist over water. Eldric watched from the doorway, a half-empty brandy snifter in hand. "Well," he said, "that went about as well as expected." Seraphina spun in place, her gown flaring out in a swirl of impossible fabric. "Oh, I don't know. We still have all this lovely food." She gestured to the untouched desserts, several of which were now singing softly in French. Eldric eyed a floating eclair with suspicion. "None of that is food anymore, is it?" "Not in the traditional sense, no." With a sigh, Eldric joined her on the dance floor, ignoring the way his feet occasionally passed through the marble tiles. The ghostly orchestra segued into a waltz that hadn't been composed yet. "Next time," Eldric muttered, as Seraphina led him in a turn, "we're hosting a séance instead." "Much simpler." Seraphina's laughter echoed through the empty ballroom, bouncing off walls that remembered other parties, other guests, other centuries. Outside, the last carriage rattled down the drive at breakneck speed, its occupants vowing never to speak of the evening again. Inside, the candles burned on. Somewhere in the gardens, the horses began to waltz. Chapter 9. The Jealous Fantôme. Lord Eldric Blackwood had grown somewhat accustomed to his wife's haunting habits, the drifting through walls, the spectral rearrangements of furniture, the occasional spontaneous weeping from the portraits. What he had not anticipated, however, was her sudden and violent objection to him speaking with other women. The trouble began on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, when Mrs. Pevensey, the vicar's widowed sister, came to discuss the church roof repairs. A sensible woman in her 50s, with the personality of well-starched linen, she had barely settled into the drawing-room chair when the temperature plummeted to Arctic levels. "I assure you, Lord Blackwood," Mrs. Pevensey said through chattering teeth, "the congregation is most concerned about the—" "Oh, dear!" Her teacup leapt from her hands and shattered against the far wall. Eldric stared at the spreading stain on the wallpaper, which suspiciously resembled a scowling face. "How clumsy of me," he lied smoothly. Let me ring for another." Before he could move, the bell pull slithered from his grasp like a live snake. Mrs. Pevensey watched in horror as it coiled itself into an elaborate knot resembling a noose. "I should perhaps return another time," she whispered, already edging toward the door. As she fled, Eldric caught a glimpse of Seraphina's form shimmering into existence behind the sofa, her arms crossed and her expression thunderous. "That," he said, "was entirely unnecessary." Seraphina's eyes narrowed. "She was flirting with you." "Mrs. Pevensey? She's a devout widow who thinks dancing is sinful." "Exactly," Seraphina hissed. "The repressed ones are always the worst." Eldric opened his mouth to argue, but the door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Things escalated from there. When Lady Rutledge called to discuss the upcoming harvest festival, all the cushions in the drawing room arranged themselves into a pyramid with a single pointed seat at the top, directly beneath a leaking ceiling beam that had never leaked before. Miss Timmins, the young and admittedly pretty new governess from the neighboring estate, fared worse. She had barely complimented Eldric's rose garden when every bloom in sight turned black and began whispering her deepest secrets in unison. She left in tears, vowing to join a convent. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had weathered 60 years of Blackwood eccentricities without flinching, found herself targeted. When she dared suggest Eldric might benefit from living companionship, all the buttons on her dress popped off simultaneously and rolled into the fireplace. "It's not natural," the housekeeper muttered the next morning, sewing herself back together with savage stitches. "That ghostly madame's acting like a jealous fishwife." Eldric, who had taken to hiding in the stables for moments of peace, sighed and patted his favorite mare's neck. She wasn't like this before the wedding. The horse gave him a look of profound equine judgment. That evening, Eldric confronted his wife in the library, where she was busy rearranging the books into increasingly alarming configurations. "This has to stop," he said, plucking a volume of sermons from where it hovered near the ceiling. "You can't terrorize every woman who speaks to me." Seraphina floated down from the top shelf, her gown billowing in a non-existent wind. "Why not?" "Because it's absurd." "Absurd?" Her form flickered dangerously. "You pledged yourself to me, Eldric, in front of witnesses. Spectral ones count. That doesn't mean I'm forbidden from basic conversation." The fire in the grate roared suddenly blue, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Several book spines rearranged themselves to spell out liar in Gothic script. Eldric pinched the bridge of his nose. "You're being unreasonable. And you're being obtuse." Seraphina drifted closer, her eyes glowing faintly. "Do you think I enjoy this? Watching you laugh with them? Seeing them touch your arm?" Her voice dropped to a whisper that raised every hair on Eldric's neck. "I had a fiancé once who promised me forever, too. Look how that ended." The temperature plunged so rapidly that Eldric's breath fogged the air. For the first time he noticed the faint silver lines around Seraphina's throat, scars he'd never seen before, thin and precise as knife cuts. A heavy silence settled between them. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 13. Eldric reached out instinctively, his hand passing halfway through her arm before he remembered. Seraphina. She pulled away, her form dissolving into mist. "Just don't make me regret trusting you, husband." By morning, Blackwood Hall had returned to its usual state of supernatural disarray. But Eldric noted the curtains now twitched suspiciously whenever a female caller approached, and the front gate developed a habit of locking itself at inconvenient moments. Mrs. Holloway summed it up best as she watched the latest visitor, the milliner's daughter, flee in terror when her hat transformed into a screeching owl. "Well," the housekeeper said dryly, "at least we're saving on tea." Upstairs, a portrait of Seraphina smirked knowingly from its frame. The war, it seemed, was far from over. Chapter 10. The Lawyer's Dilemma. Mr. Thaddeus Pinnock of Pinnock and Lucy Strife arrived at Blackwood Hall precisely at noon, as solicitors of good standing are wont to do. His boots gleamed with polish, his collar starched to knife-like precision, and his leather satchel bulged with documents pertaining to the Blackwood estate. Specifically, the matter of inheritance now that Lord Eldric had taken a wife. He had heard the rumors, of course. The entire county whispered about Lord Blackwood's peculiar marriage, though the details varied wildly depending on which drunken farmer one asked. Some claimed the bride was a witch, others insisted she was a noblewoman cursed into eternal slumber, and at least one particularly inebriated stable hand swore she was a particularly sophisticated automaton. Mr. Pimmock, being a man of reason and the law, dismissed such talk as provincial nonsense. Right up until the moment Lady Blackwood walked through a wall. She entered the study with a rustle of skirts that made no sound, her form shimmering faintly at the edges like a reflection in disturbed water. "Ah," she said, eyeing the solicitor with amusement. "The legal cavalry arrives." Mr. Pimmock's quill snapped in his fingers. Eldric, who had been watching with morbid fascination from his chair, cleared his throat. "Mr. Pimmock, may I present my wife, Lady Seraphina Blackwood?" The solicitor's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a landed fish. That is... Breathe, Mr. Pimmock," Seraphina advised, drifting closer. "It's a habit the living find useful." To his credit, the lawyer rallied admirably. He adjusted his spectacles, straightened his already immaculate cravat, and pulled a fresh quill from his case with only the slightest tremble in his hands. "My lady," he said stiffly, "a pleasure. Now regarding the matter of inheritance?" "I'm dead," Seraphina said cheerfully. Mr. Pimmock blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Quite unnecessary," she replied, settling onto the arm of Eldric's chair without actually sitting. "I have been dead for nearly a century. Murdered, in fact. Knifed by Eldric's great-great-uncle, if you'd like the gory details." The solicitor's gaze flicked to Eldric, who shrugged. "She's very forthcoming about it." Mr. Pimmock's carefully maintained composure began to crack at the edges. "That, complicates things?" "Oh, I should think so," Seraphina agreed. "Do tell me, Mr. Pimmock, does English law have provisions for spectral spouses?" "Can I inherit property?" "So for slander?" "Certainly not." "Pity. I'd have made an excellent MP." Eldric pinched the bridge of his nose. "Perhaps we should focus on practical matters." The solicitor seized upon this lifeline with both hands. "Indeed. Now, my lord, the issue is one of legal personhood. For inheritance purposes, a marriage requires both parties to be, He glanced at Seraphina, who had begun idly braiding the smoke from the fireplace. "Alive." Seraphina sighed. Typical mortal bureaucracy, no vision. Mr. Pimmock forged ahead, though his voice had developed an unfortunate squeak. "Furthermore, even if we were to disregard the physiological concerns, there remains the matter of Lady Blackwood's legal identity." "Any records of her existence would be over a century old, assuming they still..." The study door flew open with a bang, and a yellowed parchment scroll shot into the room like an enthusiastic terrier. It unfurled itself mid-air before the solicitor, revealing Seraphina's original betrothal contract to Alistair Blackwood, dated 1782. Mr. Pimmock turned pale. "Will that do?" Seraphina asked sweetly. The solicitor swallowed hard. That is to say." He reached for his handkerchief, only to find it had transformed into a funeral shroud. With a whimper he stuffed it back into his pocket. "My lord, I must advise you that the courts will never recognize this union." Eldric leaned back in his chair. He rather thought as much. "There are, however," Mr. Pimmock continued with the air of a man walking off a cliff, "certain precedents regarding posthumous legal rights. The case of Lady Eleanor Dashwood's ghostly bequest in 1632, for instance, or the infamous will of the vanishing vicar. Serafina clapped her hands in delight. A legal loophole. How delicious. For the next hour, the solicitor outlined increasingly esoteric points of law, while Serafina provided unhelpful commentary and occasionally made the ink in his notes rearrange itself into bawdy limericks. Eldric mostly poured himself brandy and wondered how his life had come to this. In conclusion, Mr. Pinnock said at last, his voice hoarse from arguing with the supernatural, while we might establish some form of trusteeship, full marital rights are— He trailed off as Serafina's phone flickered dangerously. Lynching. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously. Frost spread across the brandy decanter in intricate lace-like patterns. How disappointing, Serafina murmured. Her eyes, usually bright with mischief, had gone dark as a moonless night. And here I thought English law was meant to be civilized. Mr. Pinnock gathered his papers with shaking hands. I should take my leave to research further in London. Very far away. As the solicitor fled, his hat floating after him in clear dismissal, Eldric turned to his wife. That went well. Serafina's form solidified until she nearly looked alive, her fingers curling possessively around his shoulder. Mortals and their laws, she sniffed. As if death ever stopped anything important. Outside, the sound of Mr. Pinnock's carriage rattling down the drive at unsafe speeds echoed through the valley. Inside, the betrothal contract rolled itself up with a satisfied snap and vanished into the shadows. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 13. Eldric sighed and reached for the brandy again. You realize he'll tell everyone, don't you? Serafina's laughter curled through the room like smoke. Let him. What can they do? Sue me. The fire roared suddenly blue, casting their entwined shadows against the wall. One solid, one flickering at the edges, neither caring much for the rules of the living. Chapter 11. The Exorcist's Unexpected Visit. The Reverend Septimus Thorne arrived at Blackwood Hall, armed with holy water, a well-thumbed Bible, and the unshakable confidence of a man who had never encountered anything his faith couldn't explain. The village council had sent him, after Mr. Pinnock's hysterical account of his visit, though the solicitor's description of a spectral Jezebel who rearranges legal documents by thought alone had been edited to spiritual disturbances in the official correspondence. Eldric received the Reverend in the library, where Serafina had taken to nesting in the chandelier, like a particularly literate bat. Reverend Thorne, Eldric said with a strained smile, what an unexpected blessing. The Reverend, a gaunt man with eyes like burned holes in parchment, clasped his hands piously. Lord Blackwood, I come at the behest of troubled souls. The village speaks of irregularities in your household. Behind him a book floated off the shelf and began aggressively annotating itself in mid-air. Eldric cleared his throat. My household is perfectly regular for a house with a ghostly wife. The Reverend's smile didn't waver, though his grip on the Bible tightened. Ah yes, the alleged spirit bride. Serafina chose at that moment to drift down from the chandelier, her form shimmering like mist over a grave. Alleged? She sniffed. How very lawyerly of you, Reverend. To his credit, Reverend Thorne didn't scream. He did, however, drop his holy water. The vial passed harmlessly through Serafina's form before shattering on the floor. That was wasteful, Serafina observed, though I admire the commitment to dramatics. The Reverend drew himself up to his full height. Unclean spirit. Oh, I bathe regularly, Serafina interrupted. Metaphorically speaking. I command you in the name of the Almighty to depart this house. Serafina floated in a lazy circle around him. Which Almighty? The Old Testament smiter? The New Testament redeemer? The apocryphal trickster who gave us talking donkeys? The Reverend blinked. There is only one god demon. She sighed. Honestly, for a professional exorcist, your theology is disappointingly rigid. Eldric sank into a chair, pouring himself a generous brandy as the debate. "If one could call it that," continued. Reverend Thorn brandished his Bible like a shield. "The book of Hebrews states that it's appointed unto men once to die." Seraphina finished. "Yes, yes, and yet here I am. Perhaps your scripture needs a footnote." The Reverend switched tactics, sprinkling salt in a haphazard circle around himself. Seraphina watched with amusement as the grains levitated and rearranged themselves into a rude approximation of the Reverend's face. "Really," she said, "if you're going to perform an exorcism, at least do it properly. The Latin alone should take hours. And where's your incense, your chanting monks, your dramatic wind machine?" Reverend Thorn's face purpled. "This is no jest, Spectre." "No? Then why am I laughing?" For the next hour, they engaged in what could only be described as a theological duel. The Reverend quoted scripture. Seraphina countered with apocryphal texts. He invoked saints. She name-dropped obscure medieval mystics. When he attempted to banish her with the rite of exorcism, she corrected his pronunciation of the Latin. "You missed the subjunctive in the third clause," she tutted, materializing behind him to peer over his shoulder. "Honestly, if you're going to send souls to perdition, do it with proper grammar." The Reverend's hands shook as he turned to a new passage. Revelation 21:8 states that the cowardly and unbelieving will end up in a lake of fire. "Yes," Seraphina interrupted. "But have you actually read the Greek? That particular translation is hotly contested." Eldric, now his third brandy, decided to intervene. "Reverend, might I suggest this isn't productive?" The Reverend ignored him, sweat beading on his brow as he flipped desperately through his Bible. 1 Peter 3:19. "Christ preached to the spirits in prison." Seraphina clapped her hands in delight. "Exactly. Even the Son of God didn't banish us wholesale. He held Q and a sessions." The Reverend's eyes bulged. He made one last, desperate attempt, splashing what remained of his holy water in Seraphina's direction. The droplets hung in midair before reversing course to splash his own face. "Really," Seraphina said as the Reverend sputtered, "you should read your own texts more carefully. Matthew 7:1, Reverend." Or are we skipping the inconvenient verses today?" The Reverend collapsed into a chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His Bible lay open to Psalms, though someone, or something, had rearranged the letters to spell "go away" in the margins. Eldric took pity on him. "Mrs. Holloway will show you out." As the defeated Reverend staggered from the room, Seraphina materialized beside Eldric, her form glowing faintly with satisfaction. "That was fun," she said. "Do you think he'll come back with reinforcements?" Eldric eyed the empty brandy decanter. "God help us if he does." Seraphina's laughter echoed through the library, shaking loose a shower of dust from the rafters. "Oh, darling," she said, drifting toward the window where the last of the evening light made her almost transparent. "Haven't you learned by now? God helps those who help themselves." Outside, Reverend Thorn's horse reared violently before bolting down the drive, its rider clinging desperately to its neck. Inside, the books quietly reshelved themselves in proper order, except for the Bible, which remained defiantly open to its altered page. Somewhere in the walls, the house sighed contentedly. The haunting, it seemed, would continue. Chapter 12. The Nobleman's Regret, slight but growing. Lord Eldric Blackwood stood in what had once been his perfectly ordinary study, and contemplated the tapestry that had appeared overnight on the east wall. The weaving depicted what appeared to be his own wedding, if his wedding had been attended by skeletal figures in rotting finery and officiated by a goat-headed bishop. The embroidery shimmered unnaturally when viewed from the corner of the eye, and the eyes of the woven figures followed one around the room with unsettling focus. This, Eldric said to no one in particular, was a mistake. The curtains fluttered in agreement despite the absence of any breeze. It had begun subtly enough. A rearranged portrait here, a mysteriously stained rug there. But since their unconventional marriage, Serafina had taken to improving Blackwood Hall with the enthusiasm of a particularly deranged interior decorator. The grand staircase now featured balusters, carved to resemble screaming faces. The library's shelves rearranged themselves to form cryptic messages at midnight, and the once placid garden statues had developed a habit of weeping blood-red sap during the full moon. Eldric had tried reasoning with her. Must the candelabra be made of bones? He'd asked just last evening. They're very stylish bones, Serafina had replied from within the fireplace, her form wreathed in blue flames. And they hold candles perfectly. They're finger bones. Exactly, so practical for gripping. Now, as Eldric stared at the nightmare tapestry, the woven version of himself turned its head and winked. Mrs. Holloway entered with the Morning Post, her expression carefully neutral as she stepped around a patch of carpet that had begun growing moss in the shape of Serafina's initials. "My lord," she said, placing the letters on his desk, "Cook wishes to know if you'll be dining in tonight. She's attempting a new recipe." Eldric eyed the way the desk drawer was breathing. "Will it involve ingredients that scream when boiled?" "Only the mushrooms," she says. "Then by all means." As Mrs. Holloway retreated, a cold presence materialized at Eldric's elbow. "You're sulking again," Serafina observed, drifting through the desk to peer at his correspondence. "I'm not sulking. I'm contemplating how quickly my home has become a Gothic novel." She pouted, a gesture that would have been charming if her lower lip hadn't briefly detached and floated away before reattaching itself. "You used to say this house was dreary." It was. Now it's actively hostile. As if to prove his point, a quill on the desk suddenly sprouted teeth and hissed at him. Serafina waved a dismissive hand, and the quill returned to normal, though it kept making quiet, gnashing sounds when it thought no one was listening. "You're just resistant to change." Eldric rubbed his temples. "I married a ghost, let you redecorate in early mortuary chic, and haven't had a hot meal in weeks because the cutlery keeps trying to stab me. If anything, I've been alarmingly accepting of change." Across the room, the tapestry's depiction of their wedding feast suddenly developed moving parts, the spectral guests lifting goblets that dripped something dark and thick. Eldric decided not to look too closely. Serafina floated around him, her form becoming more substantial as she trailed icy fingers along his shoulders. "You're forgetting the benefits, husband. Eternal devotion, a wife who never ages, and think of the savings on candles. I provide my own glow." As if to demonstrate, she brightened momentarily, casting the room in eerie blue light that made the shadows in the corners twitch uncomfortably. Eldric caught sight of his reflection in the window, a harried-looking man with increasingly wild hair, holding a conversation with empty air. The reflection winked at him, then changed to show an image of himself lying dead in a coffin. Serafina curled possessively atop his chest like a cat. He turned sharply from the glass. "That's not helping." Serafina sighed, the sound like wind through dead leaves. "Very well. What would make you happy? A single room that doesn't try to eat visitors. Boring. Dinner without auditory hallucinations? Unimaginative." Eldric paused, then gestured to the tapestry. "At least make it stop, whatever that is." For a long moment, Serafina studied her handiwork. The woven figures froze mid-celebration, their hollow eyes wide with anticipation. Finally, she snapped her fingers, and the tapestry transformed into a comparatively sedate hunting scene, though the hounds had too many legs and the trees bled when viewed from certain angles. "There," she said. "Compromise." Eldric opened his mouth to argue, but the grandfather clock chose that moment to chime 13. The sound accompanied by a chorus of faint wails from the cellar. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed repeatedly, each impact shaking dust from the rafters. Serafina beamed. "See? Home sweet home." As she vanished through the ceiling, leaving behind only the scent of grave dirt and faded roses, Eldric sank into his chair. The seat cushions sighed mournfully beneath him. Outside, the sky darkened prematurely, though it was only noon. Inside, the walls exhaled, and somewhere deep in the house, something chuckled wetly. Eldric poured himself a drink from the decanter, which had begun producing brandy without being refilled. A small mercy amid the chaos. As he sipped, he contemplated the hunting tapestry, where one of the woven figures had just turned to look directly at him, its smile stretching far too wide. The regret, he decided, was no longer quite so slight. Chapter 13. The Ghost's Hidden Past. The diary surfaced on a rain-lashed Tuesday, when Eldric stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the library's oldest desk. The leather-bound volume practically leapt into his hands, its cover embossed with fading gilt letters that read "Property of Lady S.L. If found, please return unread, especially you, Alistair." Eldric blew a century's worth of dust from the pages, sending up a cloud that formed brief, screaming faces before dissipating. The first entry bore a date from 1782, written in an elegant hand that was unmistakably Seraphina's. June 14th. Betrothed today to Lord Alistair Blackwood, a man whose personality brings to mind a damp handkerchief left in a cellar. His proposal consisted of listing my faults followed by a detailed accounting of my dowry. "I've accepted, naturally, as apparently even hell must be preferable to another season of mother's matchmaking." Eldric turned the fragile page carefully, the paper whispering beneath his fingers like dead leaves. The entries progressed with increasing exasperation. July 3rd. Discovered Alistair keeps a ledger of all his past romantic disappointments, organized by category. Too talkative, insufficiently pale, laughed at my hat. "My name appears in red ink with several question marks." Charming. August 19th. The wedding plans grow increasingly grim. Alistair insists on black roses and a requiem mass. "When I suggested music might be pleasant," he replied, "dancing leads to impure thoughts. I immediately commissioned a minuet in his honor titled, 'The Prudes.'" The rain lashed harder against the windows as Eldric read on, the ink occasionally shifting color or forming tiny, angry doodles in the margins. One particularly vicious sketch depicted Alistair with donkey ears, and the caption I intended, "Intolerable." Then the tone darkened. October 31st. Tonight Alistair revealed his true intentions. The Blackwood fortune is gone, lost in some scheme or another, and he means to restore it through my death. Apparently there's some absurd clause in his family's entail about posthumous inheritances for widowers. He showed me the knife he means to use. Silver, with a nasty little curve to the blade, and had the gall to compliment my neck. Eldric's fingers tightened on the diary. The next entry was written in a shackier hand, the ink blurred in places. November 1st. I've locked myself in the East Tower. Alistair is drunk and singing hymns outside the door. If this is my final entry, let it be known I died as I lived. Tragically witty and in possession of excellent bone structure. The remaining pages were blank. Eldric sat back, the diary heavy in his hands. A cold draft curled around his neck, and suddenly Seraphina was there, peering over his shoulder. "Reading my private thoughts, husband?" Her voice was light, but the temperature in the room dropped precipitously. Eldric didn't turn. "You never told me the details." Seraphina drifted around to face him, her form flickering like a guttering candle. What was there to tell? The man was a miserly, murderous bore. He got the knife in eventually, though I like to think I made it difficult for him. She plucked the diary from his hands, the pages fluttering like startled birds. I screamed in Latin, very off-putting for an amateur killer. Eldric studied her, the way the candlelight passed through her wrists, the faint silvery lines at her throat that he now understood too well. And after? Serafina snapped the diary shut with a sound like a tomb ceiling. After was dull. I haunted Alistair, of course, drove him to madness within a year. He died babbling about the laughing woman in the walls. She smiled, showing too many teeth. I still visit his grave sometimes. The headstone makes an excellent back-scratcher. Outside, the storm reached a crescendo, lightning illuminating the library in flashes that made the shadows rise. Eldric found himself torn between horror and something dangerously close to admiration. "You could have told me," he said at last. Serafina floated closer, her cold fingers brushing his cheek. "And spoil the mystery? Where's the fun in that?" She pressed a kiss to his forehead that left frost behind. "Besides, you're much more interesting when you're confused." As she vanished through the bookshelves, the diary floated after her like an obedient hound. Eldric stared at the space she'd occupied, now empty save for a faint scent of roses and the distant sound of someone humming a minuet. Somewhere in the house a door slammed. The clock struck 13. And Eldric Blackwood, heir to a fortune built on murder and haunted by its consequences, poured himself a very large drink. Chapter 14. The Neighbors' Complaints. The delegation arrived just after dawn, huddled together on Blackwood Hall's front steps like a flock of particularly nervous sheep. There was Farmer Griggs with his pitchfork, which had begun glowing faintly blue whenever he neared the estate. Widow Peebles clutching a sack of herbs that did absolutely nothing to ward off spirits, and Magistrate Horncroft looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Holloway admitted them with the air of a woman watching rats scurry into her pantry. Lord Eldric Blackwood received them in the morning room, which had recently developed the habit of rearranging its furniture whenever visitors blinked. He sat with perfect composure as a teacup floated past his shoulder to settle gently in Magistrate Horncroft's trembling hands. "We've come," the magistrate began, then paused as the tea inside the cup changed from Earl Grey to something that smelled suspiciously of grave dirt about the disturbances. Eldric sipped his own tea, which had remained mercifully normal. What disturbances would those be? Farmer Griggs brandished his glowing pitchfork. "The wailin', the moanin'. Last Tuesday my prize milk cow floated 20 feet in the air, recitin' French poetry." Her accent was atrocious, came Serafina's voice from the chandelier, though the chandelier itself appeared empty. Widow Peebles made a sign against evil that might have been more effective had her fingers not been shaking so badly. "The butcher says his cleavers won't stop dancing. The vicar's wife claims her undergarments keep tying themselves into nooses, and just last night every weather vane in the village pointed to Blackwood Hall while whispering your name." Eldric sighed. "That does sound inconvenient." "It's more than inconvenient," Magistrate Horncroft snapped, then immediately paled as his teacup sprouted tiny hands and began slowly strangling itself with its own string. "It's unnatural." From somewhere in the walls, Serafina laughed, the sound echoing through the room like wind through a crypt. "Of course it's unnatural. That's rather the point, isn't it?" The delegation huddled closer together. Even Mrs. Holloway, who considered fear a sign of poor breeding, edged slightly nearer to the fireplace poker. Eldric set down his cup. "What exactly would you have me do?" "Control your... Magistrate Horncroft gestured vaguely at the air where a candlestick was now doing a passable imitation of the waltz. "Wife?" The word hung in the air, followed by an ominous silence. Then every painting in the room swung violently to face the wall, while the grandfather clock belched forth a cloud of black smoke that formed the words, "Try it before dissipate." Farmer Griggs let out a sound that was absolutely not a whimper. "We're simple folk, my lord. We don't want no trouble. But old Tom the shepherd says he saw your lady wife floating through the churchyard last night, rearranging the headstones into rude words." "Spelling practice," Serafina murmured from inside the magistrate's hat. Widow Peebles clutched her herb bag tighter. and the miller's daughter swears her doll now speaks only in Latin curses. Her conjugation was atrocious. The doll in question said from beneath the settee, its voice dripping with disdain. Magistrate Horncroft, to his credit, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Lord Blackwood, surely you see this cannot continue. There are laws against. He gestured helplessly as a serving spoon floated past his nose and began aggressively stirring his tea without permission. Eldric leaned back in his chair, which promptly scooted 3 inches to the left of its own accord. "If you're suggesting I divorce my wife." The windows shattered inward, spraying glass that turned to rose petals before hitting the floor. "I believe you'll find death has already done that." The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that everyone's breath fogged the air. The floating spoon froze mid-stir, encased in ice. Then, slowly, deliberately, Seraphina materialized in the center of the gathering, her form more solid than any of them had ever seen it. She wore a gown that might have been fashionable a century ago, if fashion had included fabric woven from shadows and the occasional human tooth. "My dear neighbors," she purred, drifting a slow circle around the trembling group. "How kind of you to visit. I do so love company." Her fingers trailed along the back of Widow Peebles' chair, leaving frost in their wake. "Shall I make you feel more at home? A nice cold draft down the spine? A chorus of ghostly children singing nursery rhymes backward?" Or perhaps she leaned in close to Farmer Griggs, whose beard had begun to freeze solid. "You'd prefer I return your cow? I've been teaching her Greek." The magistrate found his voice first. "We meant no offense, my lady, only could you perhaps haunt more quietly?" For a long moment, Seraphina considered this. Then she smiled, a slow, terrible smile that showed far too many teeth. "No, but him ahead." With that, the door flew open of its own accord, letting in a gust of wind that smelled inexplicably of rotting roses. The delegation didn't so much leave as flee in disorder, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Magistrate Horncroft lost his hat to a grasping coat rack. Widow Peebles left her herb bag behind, the contents of which immediately burst into green flame. And Farmer Griggs abandoned his pitchfork entirely, the implement now hovering near the ceiling and humming a dirge. As the sounds of their retreat faded down the drive, Eldric turned to his wife. "That was cruel." Seraphina caught an escaping rose petal and watched it crumble to dust in her palm. They started it. She floated closer, her cold fingers brushing his cheek. "Besides, you'd miss my little displays." Eldric opened his mouth to argue, but the truth was, he would. The thought unsettled him almost as much as the way the portrait over the mantel was now winking at him. Outside, the villagers' frantic shouts faded into the distance. Inside, the spoon finally thawed and resumed its stirring with renewed vigor. Somewhere in the cellar, something began to laugh. Chapter 15. The Attempted Annulment. Lord Eldric Blackwood had reached his limit. The wailing portraits, the self-stabbing cutlery, the way his bathwater kept forming the words, "Your soul is mine," in bubbles. It was too much. He sat in his study, which had recently begun bleeding from the walls every Thursday, with a stack of legal documents and the grim determination of a man ready to admit he'd made a terrible mistake. "The marriage can't possibly be binding," he muttered to himself, flipping through a dusty volume of ecclesiastical law. "There must be precedent." The book snapped shut on his fingers with surprising force. When he pried it open again, the text had rearranged itself to read, "Abandon all hope, ye who seek divorce." Eldric sighed and reached for the brandy decanter, which had recently taken to refilling itself with a suspiciously blood-red liquid. "I just need to prove the union was invalid from the beginning." From the rafters, Seraphina's laughter drifted down like falling leaves. "Oh, darling, you said the vows." "I said the vows. Father Mortimer pronounced us man and spirit in front of witnesses." A cold breath tickled his ear. "Even the undead have standards." Eldric ignored her and began drafting a petition to the Archbishop. The ink flowed smoothly, until he reached the phrase spectral bride, at which point his quill began writing in what appeared to be ancient Sumerian. Undaunted, he summoned Mr. Pinnock again. The solicitor arrived looking decidedly more haggard than during his previous visit, clutching a new satchel, reinforced with what appeared to be garlic and silver nails. "My lord," he began, eyeing the way the curtains twitched suspiciously behind Eldric, "ecclesiastical annulments require proof the marriage was never valid. Fraud, coercion, that sort of thing." "Coercion." Eldric seized on the word. "I was clearly under duress." The solicitor's left eyebrow began floating 3 inches above his right. "What sort of duress, precisely?" Before Eldric could answer, Seraphina materialized in the chair beside him, casually filing her nails with what looked like a human finger bone. "He begged for my hand, actually. Quite sweet, if tragically misguided." Mr. Pinnock made a noise like a deflating balloon. "My lady, I The vows were made while I was intoxicated," Eldric pressed on, ignoring the way his paperwork was slowly turning transparent. "Only slightly," Seraphina protested. "And really, if drink absolved all marital vows, half the peerage would be single." The solicitor's floating eyebrow finally reattached itself with an audible pop. "My lord, even if we could prove intoxication, which given your reputation for sobriety seems unlikely, there remains the issue of—" He gestured weakly at Seraphina, whose form had begun gently glowing. "Physical consummation." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Every candle simultaneously snuffed out. Somewhere in the distance, a choir of ghostly voices began singing a rather obscene version of Greensleeves. When the lights returned, Seraphina was perched on the edge of the desk, swinging her legs like a schoolgirl. "Would you like details, Mr. Pinnock? I've kept a diary." The solicitor turned an interesting shade of puce. "That won't be necessary." Eldric massaged his temples. "There must be another way." "Death," Seraphina offered cheerfully. "That usually does it." Mr. Pinnock gathered his papers with shaking hands. "My lord, I must advise you that spiritual unions occupy uncertain legal territory. The case of the vanishing vicar established that ghostly marriages are binding, but the 1743 ruling inspector versus mortal suggests they can be dissolved if the living party can prove." The solicitor's words cut off abruptly as his mouth sewed itself shut with glowing blue thread. Seraphina blew imaginary dust from her fingertips. "Lawyers talk too much." Eldric watched in horrified fascination as Mr. Pinnock clawed at his sealed lips. "Undo that at once. Only if he promises to stop helping you scheme against me." The solicitor nodded frantically. With a snap of her fingers, Seraphina released the spell. Mr. Pinnock gasped for air, his mustache quivering like a startled caterpillar. "I believe our business is concluded," Eldric said wearily. The solicitor didn't so much leave as evaporate in a puff of terrified efficiency. Once they were alone, Seraphina floated down to sit, or rather, hover, in the vacated chair. "You're stuck with me, darling. The sooner you accept that, the happier we'll both be." Eldric glared at her. "You bound me to, you knowing full well I'd want out." "Of course I did." She smiled, showing just a few too many teeth. "But here's the delicious part. The more you fight it, the tighter the bond becomes." She tapped his chest lightly, and Eldric felt an odd tugging sensation behind his ribs. "That's your soul getting cozy with mine. Resist too hard and—" She made a popping sound with her mouth. A long silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves like a scorned lover. Finally, Eldric reached for the brandy again. "This," he said after a long drink, "is the worst marriage in history." Seraphina laughed, the sound echoing through the room long after she'd vanished. "Oh, my sweet summer nobleman, you have no idea what's coming." As if on cue, the grandfather clock struck 13. The walls began bleeding in earnest, and somewhere deep in the house, something old and hungry began to laugh. Chapter 16. The Ghost's Revenge, mostly petty. Lord Eldric Blackwood discovered the first act of spectral vengeance when he opened his snuff-box collection to find each tiny container filled with grave dirt instead of finely ground tobacco. The 18th century French enamel piece, his favorite, now bore the faint image of a skull winking at him from the lid, an expression that suspiciously mirrored his wife's particular brand of smugness. "Serafina," he called out to the empty study. A cold draft whistled through the room, lifting the hairs on the back of his neck. The fireplace roared suddenly blue, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted into the shape of a woman lounging in the armchair across from him. "You rang, husband?" Serafina asked, examining her translucent nails as if she hadn't spent the morning haunting his belongings. Eldric held up the defiled snuff-box. This was unnecessary. She floated closer, her gown shimmering like mist over a tomb. "Was it? After your little Annulment attempt?" "I think it was perfectly proportional." Eldric opened his mouth to argue, but a faint rattling noise from the bookshelf caught his attention. His prized first edition of Vie Paradise Lostum had sprouted tiny bat wings and was now fluttering pathetically against the glass case. "That book was printed in 1669, he said through gritted teeth. "And now it's enchanting," Serafina corrected with a grin. "Much improved, if you ask me." The hauntings escalated from there. His favorite armchair developed a habit of dumping its occupant onto the floor in opportune moments. His boots tied themselves into impossible knots overnight. The portrait of his great-grandfather above the mantel, previously a stoic, dignified oil painting, now stuck its tongue out whenever Eldric walked by. The final straw came when he sat down to dinner, only to find his roast pheasant rearranged on the plate to spell apologize in peppered juice. Mrs. Holloway, who had long since accepted that cutlery had a mind of its own in Blackwood Hall, merely sighed and poured more wine, which, Eldric noted bitterly, remained completely unhaunted. Shame wasn't the one trying to dissolve a supernatural marriage. That night, Eldric lay in bed staring at the canopy, which had recently begun whispering his sins in Aramaic. He turned his head to the empty space beside him. "Must you be so childish?" The mattress dipped as Serafina materialized, stretched out on her side with her chin propped on one hand. "Must you be so mortal?" Eldric sighed. "I only wanted to be rid of me," she finished, her form flickering like a guttering candle. "Yes, I gathered." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, or at least as much silence as was possible in a house where the walls occasionally moaned in the iambic pentameter. Finally, Eldric muttered, "The snuff-boxes were excessive." Serafina's lips twitched. "The Paradise Losting was a nice touch, though. I can't sell a fluttering book." "You couldn't sell it before either," she pointed out. "Dreadfully boring edition. No marginalia, no bloodstains, not even an amusing family tree scribbled in the back." Eldric rolled onto his side to face her. "If I promise not to seek an annulment." "Yes? Will you stop turning my possessions into carnival tricks?" Serafina pretended to consider this, tapping one ghostly finger against her chin. "I'll stop the objects, but I make no promises about the livestock." Eldric groaned. The horses better not be tap-dancing again. Outside, the sound of hooves clicking in perfect rhythm against the cobblestones answered him. Serafina smirked and vanished, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the faint sound of laughter echoing from inside the wardrobe. Eldric stared at the ceiling. The canopy had switched to listing his sins in rhyming couplets. Somewhere downstairs, a clock struck 13, and in the stables, the horses began rehearsing for what sounded suspiciously like a full Broadway production. Chapter 17. The Nobleman's Desperate Bargain. Lord Eldric Blackwood had not slept properly in 17 days. His eyes burned like hot coals, His hands trembled with exhaustion, and his once impeccable cravat now hung askew in a manner that would have scandalized his valet.
If the man hadn't resigned last week after the wardrobe tried to eat his favorite waist.
He sat slumped at his desk, staring at the contract he'd drafted with all the desperation of a man who'd just watched his favorite armchair sprout teeth and growl at him. The parchment lay innocently before him, its ink still wet, its promises extraordinary. Serafina materialized in her usual dramatic fashion, first as a cold draft, then as a whisper against his neck, finally appearing fully formed in the chair opposite him. She examined the document with raised eyebrows. "Let me see if I understand this," she said, tapping one translucent finger against the page. "In exchange for ceasing all hauntings of your personal belongings and livestock," Eldric croaked. His voice had taken on the rasp of a man who'd spent too many nights listening to ghostly wails. "And livestock," Serafina continued, rolling her eyes. "You will? 1. Host a monthly séance for my deceased friends. 2. Install a haunted mirror in every room. 3. Rename the East Wing Serafina's Gallery of Eternal Whimsy?" Eldric nodded miserably. She leaned forward, her form flickering with barely contained glee. "And clause 4? Will not seek annulment, divorce, or any other form of marital dissolution, spectral or otherwise, in perpetuity?" The fire in the grate sputtered as if holding its breath. Somewhere in the walls, the house itself seemed to lean in to hear his answer. Eldric swallowed hard. "In perpetuity," he confirmed. Serafina's smile could have curdled milk. "And if I want to add amendments?" "Within reason," he said weakly. "Definir reason." Eldric gestured vaguely at the haunted ruins of his life. "Not this." For a long moment Serafina studied him. The dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands shook around his teacup, the general air of a man who'd been pushed to the very edge of sanity. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she reached out and traced her signature across the parchment in glowing blue script that burned itself into the paper. "Very well," she said. "But I'm adding a clause about the stables. The horses deserve proper costumes for their performances." Eldric opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. He'd reached that special state of exhaustion where tap-dancing stallions in tutus seemed a fair price for 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep. "Done," he muttered, signing his own name with a flourish that sent a spray of ink across the page. The droplets formed tiny, screaming faces before soaking into the parchment. The moment the contract was complete, a wave of unnatural stillness settled over Blackwood Hall. The portraits stopped their nightly wailing. The furniture ceased its ominous rearranging, and, blessedly, the canopy over his bed stopped reciting his sins in dead languages. That night, Eldric collapsed into bed with the gratitude of a drowning man reaching shore. As his eyes fluttered shut, he felt the familiar chill of Serafina curling up beside him, solid enough to be present, incorporeal enough not to disturb his rest. "You'll thank me eventually," she whispered as sleep claimed him. And against all odds, perhaps because his sanity had finally snapped like a dried twig, Eldric almost believed her. Chapter 18. The Unexpected Truce. Lord Eldric Blackwood found the book by accident while reorganizing the library, a slender volume of poetry bound in faded green leather, its pages foxed with age and neglect. He nearly sent it to the discard pile before noticing the inscription on the flyleaf. A4, "My dearest Serafina, may these words outlive us both. Yours always, E. E's say." Handwriting matched the diary he'd discovered months before. Curious, he flipped through the fragile pages. A pressed flower, long since turned to dust, drifted from between the leaves. The margins were filled with notes in that same familiar hand, some witty, some wistful, all unmistakably Serafina's. His thumb lingered on a particular page where the ink had bled slightly, as if from water droplets. Dons valediction, forbidding morning. He read the first lines aloud without thinking. Fast virtuous men pass mildly away. A sudden chill wrapped around him like an embrace. Serafina materialized so close her form nearly touched his shoulder, her usual smirk replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "Where did you find that?" Eldric held up the book. "Buried behind a stack of ledgers. Was it yours?" For a long moment, she simply stared at the volume, her fingers hovering over the cover without quite touching it. "Edmund gave it to me," she said at last, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "My brother. The only person in my family who didn't view me as either an ornament or a bargaining chip." The confession hung between them, fragile as the aged paper. Eldric hesitated, then did something he'd never dared before. He turned the book toward her. "Would you like me to read it?" Serafina's form flickered, the edges blurring like a reflection in disturbed water. "You do that? I've nothing else scheduled until the witching hour." Her laughter was softer than usual, less edged with mockery. "Then, by all means, husband, pretend you have a soul." Eldric cleared his throat and began again. "Us virtuous men pass mildly away, and whisper to their souls to go." As he read, something remarkable happened. The house itself seemed to still, the usual creaks and moans fading into respectful silence. The candles burned steadily rather than flickering, the shadows ceased their usual restless shifting. Even the ever-present drafts stilled, as if the very air was holding its breath. When he reached the final lines, "The firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun." Serafina's form had gone nearly transparent with emotion. "You remembered it," she whispered. Eldric carefully closed the book. "I didn't, but you clearly did." For once, Serafina had no witty retort, no sharp-edged comeback. She simply reached out, as much as a ghost could reach, and let her fingers hover over the embossed cover. "It was my favorite. I thought it had been lost." The moment stretched between them, fragile and unexpected. Then, with her usual flair for the dramatic, Serafina shattered it by tossing her head and scoffing. "Of course, Dawn was a dreadful libertine. Probably wrote this between mistresses." But the usual bite was absent from her tone. And when Eldric returned the book to the shelf that evening, he found it had mysteriously reappeared on his bedside table, open to the same poem. That night, for the first time since their marriage, the house was silent. Not the ominous quiet of a predator lying in wait, but the gentle hush of something at peace. Even the horses, usually engaged in their nightly theatricals, seemed to be resting. As Eldric drifted off, he felt the faintest brush of cold against his cheek, like a kiss or perhaps just a draft. Either way, he didn't flinch away. Chapter 19. The Eternal Roommate Agreement. The document stretched across Lord Eldric Blackwood's desk, like a peace treaty between warring nations, which in many ways it was. After weeks of spectral chaos and mortal exhaustion, they had finally reached an impasse that could only be resolved through negotiation. The parchment was already half filled with clauses, amendments, and several angry ink splotches where Serafina had emphatically disagreed with certain terms. Eldric rubbed his temples, his quill hovering over the latest point of contention. "No floating through walls during dinner," he read aloud. "That's perfectly reasonable." Serafina materialized in a swirl of mist and indignation, her form flickering like a candle caught in a draught. "And what if I'm me peckishy?" "Then you can manifest like a normal person and sit at the table," she gasped, pressing a translucent hand to her chest. "Normally? Darling, I haven't been normal since the French Revolution." "That explains the guillotine comment last week," Eldric muttered, scratching out another line. "Bean, you may float in the walls during dinner, but no sudden appearances inside the soup tureen. Mrs. Holloway nearly fainted last time." Serafina considered this, tapping one ghostly finger against her chin. "Compromise accepted, but I want formal acknowledgement that the soup was asking for it." Eldric sighed and added a footnote. The negotiations continued late into the evening, with Serafina arguing passionately for her right to redecorate the East Wing in early mortuary chic, while Eldric fought for the sanctity of his study, remaining possession-free. "I draw the line at haunted quills," he insisted. "They keep writing sonnets about my impending doom." Some clauses were non-negotiable. 1. Designated haunting hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., with exceptions for special occasions like All Hallows' Eve or particularly dull dinner parties. 2. No possession of living staff, with a special addendum that Mrs. Holloway was absolutely off-limits after the incident with the floating cutlery. 3. Library rights. Serafina could rearrange the books as she pleased, but only if they remained legible to mortal eyes. 4. Horse ballet, limited to one performance per week with no more than 3 tutors per stallion. The final point of contention came when Eldric hesitantly broached the subject of nighttime disturbances. "The wailing," he said carefully, "could perhaps be moderated?" Serafina's form darkened like a thundercloud. "I am a spirit of vengeance, not some mewling nursery ghost." "Yes, but must the vengeance occur at Dai-Hi-Thi in the morning?" They settled on a compromise. Mournful wails would be restricted to midnight and noon per atmosphere, while truly spectacular fits of spectral rage could be scheduled with at least 6 hours' notice. As the clock struck a irrespectable 11 p.m., another negotiated term, they finalized the agreement. Serafina signed her name in glowing blue script that burned itself into the parchment, while Eldric used his ordinary ink, though he noted with some trepidation that his signature occasionally flickered as if seen through mist. The moment the last stroke dried, the house itself seemed to exhale. The usual draft stilled, the portraits ceased their grumbling, and even the ever-present scent of grave dirt faded slightly. Serafina floated over to the window, her silhouette outlined in moonlight. "This doesn't mean I like you," she said, though the usual sharpness was absent from her tone. Eldric folded the agreement and tucked it into his desk. "Duly noted." That night, for the first time since their marriage began, Blackwood Hall was quiet, not with the eerie silence of a grave, but the tentative peace of two people, one living, one not, who had finally agreed to share the same space without driving each other completely mad. And if the horses still occasionally tap-danced in the stables, well, some compromises were worth making. Chapter 20. The Nobleman's Epilogue, mostly Resigned. Lord Eldric Blackwood sat in his study, staring at the ledger before him with the hollow-eyed weariness of a man who had long since given up on ordinary bookkeeping. The columns of numbers blurred together, interrupted periodically by the odd spectral doodle, a grinning skull here, a floating candlestick there, left by a certain restless spirit who found his financial habits dreadfully dull. Outside, the moon hung low over Blackwood Hall, casting silver light through the windows and illuminating the fine layer of frost that had begun creeping across the glass in delicate lace-like patterns. It was always frost, never ice. Serafina had once explained that frost was more atmospheric, and since their truce, she had taken to decorating the windows nightly, as if the manor were her own personal winter diorama. Eldric rubbed his temples, ignoring the way his breath fogged slightly in the chill. He had, against all odds and common sense, grown accustomed to the unnatural cold. A whisper of movement behind him made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. "You're brooding again," Serafina observed, draping herself over the back of his chair like a particularly possessive cat. "I'm accounting," he corrected, though the distinction was likely lost on her. She scoffed, her breath a ghostly puff against his ear. "Same thing, really. All those numbers lined up like little tombstones." Eldric exhaled sharply through his nose, his version of a laugh these days. "If you're here to critique my ledger-keeping, at least make yourself useful and float me the brandy." The decanter slid obediently across the desk, stopping just before his fingertips. He poured himself a measure, watching as the liquid swirled without a single drop spilling. Another small, eerie courtesy she had begun permitting since their agreement. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the house settling into its bones. It was, Eldric reflected, as close to peace as they were ever likely to get. "You're thinking too loudly," Seraphina murmured, her voice echoing faintly from the rafters. "I'm reflecting on my life choices," he said dryly. "Ah, so, a tragedy then? More of a farce." She materialized properly then, hovering just beside him, her form more solid than he'd seen in weeks. Her gown was one of her favorites, pale gray and shimmering like mist, with sleeves that trailed into nothingness. She looked almost alive, save for the way the candlelight passed straight through her. "You could have had a normal wife," she said, tilting her head. "Some simpering debutante who embroidered handkerchiefs and fainted at the sight of spiders." Eldric took a slow sip of brandy. "And miss out on the nightly hauntings?" perished the thought. Her laughter was softer now, less edged with mockery. It curled through the room like smoke, wrapping around him like the ghost of an embrace. Somewhere in the house, the grandfather clock struck 13, a habit it had stubbornly refused to break, despite all negotiations. The horses blessedly were silent tonight, likely recovering from their latest interpretive dance. Eldric closed the ledger with a sigh. There would be no more work done tonight. Not when the air had taken on that particular charged stillness that preceded one of Seraphina's moods. Sure enough, she drifted closer, her fingers brushing the back of his chair. "Come to bed, husband," she said, her voice low and teasing. The dead grow impatient. Eldric pushed back from the desk, his joints protesting the movement. He was no longer a young man, and the years of supernatural cohabitation had left their mark. More gray at his temples, more weariness in his bones. But when he turned to face her, there was no regret in his gaze. Only resignation, tinged with something dangerously close to fondness. "Lead the way, my vengeful spectre." She grinned, all sharp edges and knowing amusement, and floated ahead of him, her form flickering like candlelight as she moved through the darkened halls. Behind them, the study door closed softly on its own. The fire snuffed itself out. And somewhere in the depths of Blackwood Hall, the walls exhaled, content at last. It was not a happy ending, but it was theirs. And for now, for them, that was enough.